In this podcast, we're going to be basically go over the actual idea of the responsibilities of the executive, because a lot of people try to think that the executive has more power than it does, and the executive has also expanded what it thinks its power is. We're going to basically go over what it says blankly in the Constitution itself and go over some of the actual definitions. Now, here it says we're going to go over by this thing. This is in Article 2. Section 1 goes over basically how they gain their power, and basically how they can be removed from office and such, and for the actual compensation and replacement and those points, which is illegitimate for the actual discussion. So we're going to skip directly to section 2. And this it goes: the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army, Navy of the United States, and the militia in several states when called into actual service for the United States. Now, in this case, militia actually means the actual individuals of the actual states of the United States. And this is what would be referred to as the draft. Now, since the draft is inactive, this means that essentially this section right here is inactive. Now, what needs to be also understood is this is not in play when a president is. If a president would be declared as being tyrannical, if a state were to declare a president tyrannical, or if a group were to declare a president tyrannical, they could essentially state that they are not going to serve and have legitimate valid reasons not to serve, and that's where they would do that. Now, the next part, and that's basically why we have this militia. Now, the militia would only serve in the case of where there was friendly relations between the militia, basically meaning the armed individuals within each state and the government itself. Once that broke down and there was actually a case for overthrowing the government, this no longer takes place, and they no longer have the actual power over that. But since there actually is no active draft, this actually doesn't even become valid in itself. So essentially, no current president has the power of the militia of any state. And the militia is just armed individuals, because when you have some of these people on the left wing that want to claim that in the Second Amendment that you'll see, when we start to discuss the Second Amendment, they want to claim the Second Amendment, the militia refers to the police, which it does not. It actually refers to armed individuals. This would essentially refer to actually sending the armed police overseas to fight in battles, which would be completely irrational for any country. This is why we do not refer to the actual. That's why the militia does not refer to. That's why it does not refer to them as the militia. Police are not the militia. Police are the police. They're meant to stay there, and the militia is the individuals that are armed themselves. Now, when there is a discontent with the government as a tyranny, there's the militia no longer is going to be governed by is no longer going to serve the United States, and is going to separate. Now we go to the second part. He may require the opinion in writing of principal of the principal officer in each executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of the respective offices, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States except in the cases of impeachment. This basically means if he is not being impeached, that he can grant pardons for anything. So basically, when it comes down to it, basically, when it is not an impeachable offense to give pardons to anybody. So when they're trying to state that it doesn't matter if we're talking about Donald Trump or anybody else, if he's handing out pardons to anybody, he can actually do that regardless of the offense. And that's what needs to be understood. So when they were coming out stating that if Trump was giving out pardons to Manafort and Roger Stone and all these other people involved in the that basically were being prosecuted in the Mueller investigation, that if you were to give pardons for every one of those, that would be a case for impeachment. Actually, that's not, because that's, as we see right here, that's within his allowed duties. Does not matter what people state. That's not actually an impeachable offense, because we see right here in the Constitution that is an allowable duty that he would have. We go in the next part. He shall have the power with by and with advice of consent of by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators concur. He shall nominate with advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, judges to the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not within otherwise provided for, which shall be appointed, shall be established by law, but the Congress may, by law, vest the appointment such inferior officers as they think proper in the president alone, in the courts of law, and or in the heads of the department. Basically meaning that you're supposed to have a 60 vote threshold for any of these things, either treaties or appointments that go through the Senate. Well, due to the Harry Reid's nuclear option that he put through, so Obama could get extremist people through for his nominations. We now have a vote threshold of a bare minimum of just 51 of those majority votes. This now no longer stands, so this is essentially that was to break actually Senate rules. So that no longer stands. So essentially, all it has to do is just basically nominate and barely pass. But that's not actually breaking. That's not actually the president doing it. That's actually the Senate breaking the rules, and the Senate never readjusted the rules because of fear of partisan attack. Basically, partisan blocking of any type of nomination because of them losing the previous election. The president shall have power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during recess of the Senate by granting commissions shall expire at the end of their sessions. Basically, if there's during any recess of the Senate, he can fill any vacancies out there. Basically, anytime the Senate's in recess, he can basically fill anything out there. Doesn't need consent. Now, this is one of the things where Obama got actually in trouble for actually basically he basically wanted to say the Senate was in recess when they weren't, and he actually got in trouble for trying to push through people that would never have passed in a million years. Now let's go down to section 3. He shall, from time to time, give Congress information of the State of the Union and recommendation to their consideration. From such measures shall he judge necessary and expedient. Basically, with that is this: basically he has to give a State of the Union. This does not necessarily stating that he actually has to do it verbally, as if we've noticed in the past, he actually has to do it by paper, but historically, because the media can't deal without it, they scream if they would scream if a president did it without it being televised. Because as we know, nobody in their right minds that's actually a citizen wants to actually watch this damn thing. He may, on extraordinary occasions, convene both houses, either of them in the case of disagreement between them with respect to time of adjournment. He may adjourn both of them to such time he shall think proper. He shall receive ambassadors and or public ministers. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He shall commission all the officers of the United States. Basically, is if there's any type of disagreement within the houses to basically get things done, he can basically force them together to basically essentially create some type of legislation that's basically done as a compromise bill between both houses. And also, when it comes down to it, is the other major thing is basically this. Another thing is he needs to essentially ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. Now, this is one of the major things that a lot of presidents make huge mistakes on. Is they basically state, well, I'm not going to execute the laws because I don't agree with them. While Trump has done a relatively fair job with it, we found that when it came to Obama, especially on immigration, he stated that, well, I don't like the way the immigration law is written on the books, so I'm not going to enforce it. And this is where we've gotten to a lot of the problems. It created a huge incentive for people to jump over the border without and think that there's a huge incentive of free money and free stuff because of that. And he basically ordered departments essentially not to follow the law that was actually written in Congress. And this is exactly a violation of the Constitution, but we were not seeing that the judicial department, the judicial branch, was actually enforcing its position and stating he is not upholding the Constitution, because we have a law in the books and he refuses to uphold that. And it says, shall commission all the officers of the United States. Basically, that's kind of irrelevant when it comes down to the job, because most of the stuff is done. Number 4, Vice President, all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for the conviction of treason, bribery, and all high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, when it comes down to the idea of that with it, we can technically call the idea of these lobbyist bribery. So in many ways, because they're essentially trying to subvert the actual form of the way the Constitution works, and because they're trying to create a system to where people are not going to act upon their own conscience, but are going to act upon what money is coming in for either their elections or for their for what they need to bring in for donations for their party. When it comes down to keeping their leadership positions, now this is not just within the executive. A lot of times this falls flat on the face of Congress. And they technically are not even classifying this as, they go, oh, it's not bribery, it's just taking donations. Well, the fact is that's when you do with lobbyists, that's technically bribery, because you're basically, this can impact the way the system is working. And when we look at that, it impacts the way the what they do with it. And then when we look at what they can't do is we're finding a lot of the executives are starting to do the actual powers that are actually vested in Section 1, which is the legislative branch. And this is where we get a lot of problems. We're seeing that especially with the executive, it's thinking it can actually go and actually declare war. We see specifically that, where do we see this? In which section is that? Right here in basically in Article 1, Section 8, we see right here that that the legislative body has right here, you'll see down right here, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Right there, it shows you right specifically there that this is actually the actual function of the executive. We also see that this is what we've seen happen in the executive branch. This is a major problem. We've also see the actual, now this is not with this administration, but the previous administration, we've seen them actually make a bunch of regulations out of the executive. And we see right here, to make rules of government and regulation on the land and naval forces. Well, the fact is the executive can't regulate. That's the job of the legislative branch. That's not, we specifically see on that right there. That's Section 8 again. So those are two powers essentially that the executive has usurped from the just big time within the last administration. Just within that, the idea to declare war with it, I mean, they have not actually declared war from the legislative body since World War II. And we're talking we're getting close to what's that? That's over 70 years now. And that's pathetic. We're getting pretty close to the 80-year. We're getting pretty close to the 80-year mark on that for the declaration of war from World War II. And when we talk about that, that's a pretty pathetic thing. That we have to be 80 years away. That we have to be near 80 years away from that actual thing. That where it would be like 80 years away. That's from when we actually declared war last in an actual war itself. Now, when we actually look at what's actually legitimate, that's not a legitimate way to actually run government. When we actually look at the way government's supposed to be run, and the executive doesn't have these powers, and it doesn't matter. They can say, "Oh, well, we can run something for a few months with it of bombing with it." No, you don't have that authority. Wherever they think that authority comes from with it is illegitimate, because, as we see, the Constitution is very, very direct. It limits to whatever powers it states in this, plus whatever powers it states within the amendments, is the complete limitation of the actual federal government. Nothing more, and that's the whole point. And that's the great thing about that with it. The idea of the Constitution is to limit the government, not to limit the people. And what we see with it is we see that the people in government had the complete idea backwards. I've seen Harry Reid essentially state the complete idea backwards. We don't have a constitution to limit the people. We have a constitution to limit the government. He thinks we have a constitution because government is benevolent. No, we have a constitution because government is malevolent, and we need that limited. Government is inherently evil. Government isn't inherently good. If government was inherently good, we wouldn't need a constitution itself, and that's the whole point that needs to be made. And that's why what we do is we essentially establish these things. And even if you go to the idea of such things as you'll go through such things as Bill of Rights, you go through the Bill of Rights and you'll actually see different things of the amendments, and you'll see nothing in there that actually grants them that grants the executive any extra rights for going to war. You'll never see it in anything from the later amendments as well. And that's the whole point, is nothing in here grants them any privileges to go to war from an executive. And that's the whole point that they need to understand, is if you want to declare war, it has to be done through Congress. And nothing has ever been declared since that point, meaning every war since World War II is illegitimate. And you do not gain any powers to go to war from the UN. The UN is an illegitimate body. It is the actual powers you get to go to war are from Congress. That's the whole point. So if you want to go to war, get all your powers from Congress. You don't get any more than that. That's the whole point. That's why we have this Constitution. We have it here, and that's why we are a sovereign nation. We aren't the UN. This isn't the United States or the United Nations. This is the United States of America. We are actually our own country. We aren't just this basic conglomeration of the United Nations. So you actually have to follow the Constitution. You don't just get to say, hey, I'm just going to step aside from the Constitution and I'm just going to follow what the UN wants or what NATO wants. No, that doesn't work that way. You follow what the Constitution says, because the fact is that's the ultimate law of the land. It doesn't matter if another NATO country is being attacked and nobody here votes for war. Guess what? That other country in NATO is getting attacked, and we're not going to war for them. That's how things work. And if they say that means that you can't be you're not an ally of NATO, then guess what? We're just gonna have to step aside from NATO, because that's what it means. Because the fact is there are certain policies that basically we have to follow as either from each one of these branches, from judicial, your legislative, and your executive. And there's if you can't get those votes to actually do it from each one of those groups, then you can't get the votes. And that doesn't mean you from those executive parts get to give out fraudulent intelligence like they did in Iraq to try to convince certain people that there's an actual weapons of mass destruction. That's not legitimate. You don't get to basically lie to convince people that, hey, this is a reason to go and attack. That's not what you get to do. You have to give them actual legitimate evidence if you're going to make a compelling case. It needs to be what is the reason for going into war? What is actually the compelling case for there would actually be a reason for the United States to enter? Because you're putting United States lives on the line. Is there any reason that would actually directly impact United States security itself? If there isn't, guess what? We don't go to war. And that's what you need to realize. This is how these things go, and that's why when you actually follow the Constitution, it's nearly impossible to get a vote to go to war, because no one wants to actually make that decision, put people's blood on the line. And when it comes down to it, yes, handing out weapons to other countries is a vote for war, because you're doing the same thing. And if you apply the same principle, you're not going to get the actual votes either with that. Because when you vote for the thing, like with the Yemen war, you're not going to get the same thing. That's why the Yemen war is being voted down. And you need to understand that's the same idea. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all the way around on social media. Make sure your friends and subscribe to my channel. Make sure everyone out there that you can get subscribes to my or not my Facebook channel, but my YouTube channel. But make sure they you can get everyone out there on social media subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I will see you guys tomorrow, because I'm probably gonna skip the live stream tonight because I'm not feeling the best. And bye, everyone.